Okay, so that's a lot of names. Thank you, Heather. This is how we test our seminary students. Yes, Matthew's genealogy of Jesus has 42 names and sets of 3, sets of 14 generations from Abraham to David, 14 generations from King David to Babylonian exile, 14 generations from the exile to Jesus. Now, in Scripture, the number 7 represents wholeness and completion, so 7 generations, 6 times over, was meant to be a good sign for Jesus. Something significant is happening here. Now, in this season of Advent, we return again to the story of the Christ child born into this wonderful and pain-filled world. This is an event that seems to take place at one moment in time in history, and yet with this genealogy, we begin to see that this birth is one very important point in a long process, a process of life evolving and generations growing and struggling and surviving and thriving and making mistakes and learning how to live in this wonderful world that we are all a part of. On this Advent season, this year, we read the Christmas story and we're getting to know the people, the families who found themselves following God in this particular time in very surprising ways. But we also want to see this story and our stories from the perspective of the 7-generation principle. Now, the 7-generation principle is actually a philosophy of the Iroquois people, and it emphasizes how 7 generations after us will be affected by our current actions and decisions. It's asking us to consider what will sustain and benefit the generations that come after us. So to do that, we need to take the long view. We need to see ourselves as belonging to this wide web of interconnections. And that's not that easy. For humans, thus humans that we are trying to keep up with details day by day, it's difficult to keep up with what's right in front of us. And we're not so good at thinking seriously about the distant future. And this is reflected in many places, in government systems that work on a 4 to 5 year plan, business plans that just look to the next quarter, social media, they hope to get 3 seconds of your attention on each video they make, shorter and shorter. And as a result, in our culture, short-term successes are rewarded over long-term wellness. So 7-generation thinking focuses on this thread that connects us through time. How we are the result of 7 generations prior to our birth, and then how we have impact on those who will exist 7 generations away from us into the future. I really think that this is what our genealogy of Jesus is helping us to see. Diana Butler Bass, in her book Grounded, suggests that these begat so-and-so are not really boring. They tell stories. They tell stories of belonging and our sacred location in the work of God in the world. Sometimes these stories surprise us, especially when they reveal some conflicting impulses, the ones that we recognize in our own souls. These biblical genealogies are not meant to be historically complete, but rather they're meant to send a message. The writer of Matthew presents Jesus as the King of the Jews. And he writes, "This is an account of the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham." But we have a genealogy in Luke's gospel too, and we find some different names included. His is a genealogy that emphasizes the unity of the whole human family. And not just the kings and the military leaders, but much of the story is about regular people who were trying to be faithful to God. Butler Bass continues, telling us that ultimately this search for ancestry, one that we find ourselves on again in our time, is a quest for connections, There's something that is in the roots of our families. Now, many of us have found ourselves disconnected from our own family roots because during much of recent history, people have had to escape their ancestral lands, their families, in order to find freedom to make their own way in the world. Others have been forcefully removed from their homelands and find themselves in new places. But escaping our own family history is not an easy thing to do because we carry our ancestors within us. We carry our ancestors within us. This is a truth that can be comforting or it can be concerning. It begs the question, what if we don't like our families or the history that we find? Our dysfunctional relationships, histories of abuse, our families might be a great source of delight. They might be the source of our deepest insecurity and shame. It is helpful now in our time that psychology is moving away from its long-held emphasis on individuality, beginning to recognize that we all live within systems of emotional interdependence. This emotional interdependence that is embedded in us and modeled for us by the families we were born into. Now, some forms of therapy explore and allow us to explore the negative aspects of our family systems and our family history, empowering individuals to maybe differentiate when that's helpful, to get away from unhealthy relationships, to form healthier bonds with siblings and parents, finding new self-discovery. In therapy, we're encouraged to draw our genealogies. I don't know if anybody has done that before, writing out parents and their siblings and grandparents and their siblings and the great-grandparents and their siblings, and begin to look not only at the names, but what happened and where were people hurt and where were people happy and how has that come together to be a part of who I am. Genealogies can help us discern how pain and shame and abuse and anxiety and sometimes addictions might have been present in the past, helping us in our personal self-discovery. Ancestry, the process of handing down patterns of faith, patterns of joy, and patterns of despair. And these patterns often open up new paths for mental, emotional, spiritual healing within us. The thing that we are finding is that the more honest we are in telling the stories, our stories and the stories of our ancestors, the more we will be able to understand ourselves and the possibilities that are carried in our emotional DNA and how that will affect the future generations. I really think this is what we find hidden in this genealogy of Jesus. Jesus may be the king of a royal line of David, but his family is pretty much a lot like the rest of ours. Matthew just puts it out there. Jesus, the son of Joseph, has a family genogram that could keep a therapist occupied for years. And I'd go through all these stories, but it would take us all day. But there's a lot of soap opera stories in those names that we read today. Jesus belongs to a lineage of youthful courage and abusive imperial power and murder and some wisdom and some incest and some good events and some fratricide. David and his sons were spectacularly veering from their covenant with God, again, with soap opera stories. But we find within the scriptures that God's redemption absorbs even the most despicable histories. We learn that Jesus is kin to those who need forgiveness the most. There are so many imperfect and immoral descendants of Jesus that maybe we can relate a little bit more to the full range of this family tree. Now, Dr. Christine Hong points out that just as many of these names that are found in Jesus' genealogy revealed the relationship across time and space in his life, so also many of the names that tie us to the generations who came before us, and our names will tie us to the generations that come after us. Names are the seeded hope of one generation planted in another. They are a thread that connects our histories, our stories, and our futures. For we are the hope of those who have come before us, and we live in hope for those who will come after us. This record of Jesus' family tree is a tapestry of mismatched strings that have been woven together. The untidiness of Jesus' lineage emphasizes the many ways that God grafts families in different and unexpected ways. So this beautiful patchwork lineup of Jesus' spiritual ancestors, well, it creates more room for the blended families that we find ourselves in today. Families created through adoption, through chosen families of friendships that carry us through this journey of life. People were meant to flourish together, to build and rebuild, to bless and be blessed. We build and we bless by remembering that we are not alone. We live within 7 generations in either directions. We are the culmination of generations that have come before us. So our Advent theme this year is a call to action. What are we called to generate and bring forth? What have your ancestors and those who have come before you passed on to you that you want to continue? We begin to see that the work of God is always unfolding in the world, in and through us, in and through our stories. So I want to conclude with a poem from Reverend Sarah Speed that reminds us that every story is important and that there is room for every story in God's wonderful plan for life. She writes, I asked God, what about my fingernail biting habit or the way I leave all the cabinets open in the kitchen? What about the way I can be dramatic and drumming up a fight only to hand out apologies like souvenirs? What about the way I second-guess myself and let shame drive, or I stay quiet when I have something to say? What about the way that I chase accomplishments like a dog with a bone? What about the doubt or the fact that I'm terrible at prayer and I can't help but yawn during church? What about my baggage might be too big for the van? But then God called me by my first and middle name, which always means business. He said, who told you that you were too much? Sugar, there is so much room for you here. So that's when I grabbed a seat and we hit the road, and I knew right then that the rumors were true. There is room. There is room. There is room. So this Advent, may you remember that you belong to a story that is etched in the wrinkles of time, the generations that have come before, to the generations that will come after, and to a God of love that will not let you go. We will continue to think about the generations before and after us throughout our Advent season. But for now, let's continue to worship in song.